Welcome to part two of our conversation with Daniel Bessner from the University of Washington, author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speier, and the Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. Boom, got it. Daniel was just telling me, he's like, I love Hans Speier. He was such a great man.
He's great. He's, he really just had it all.
Got a lot of swag. Do you remember my cartoon idea where
good.
my dangerously anti-Semitic, like Hans Speier as like little mice, and they were just like with like little flow charts, and the dumb Gentile army guys were like bulldogs, but like the mice told them what to do. It's just like, because you need an Air Force more.
Like Dr. Strange.
So stupid. Or maybe a little bit. I think he was a little nicer than Kissinger. All right, this is part two of our conversation. We were talking about unlearning habits in the beginning. We'll keep some of that going, but let's try to be more constructive here in part two. I want to start with, basically, like, what is your framework? I mean, obviously, feel free to mention my book, but you've talked about Gramsci a lot. You also, and I want to get to more specifically in the second half of this idea of getting serious about institution building. But what would be a big framework for a positive, appealing, dynamic, and not culturally bifurcated, limited left?
Sure. Well, I think I guess maybe I'm interpreting this question the wrong way, so tell me so. But I guess in the most sort of broad terms, I think that the sort of the base and the superstructure inform each other. And so, like, for people who aren't like totally familiar with Marx's theory, Marx has this idea that like the base of society it consists of the means of production, and everything that else that is in society that is not the means of production, from politics to culture to social relations, for example, the organization of the family, why a school looks the way it does, why roads look the way they do, whatever it may be, is ultimately related to the fact that the means of production of a particular political economy inform how the world exists. And I think there's a lot to that. However, I think what later theorists have done to sort of like augment Marx, people like Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, or Walter Benjamin, the Frankfurt School, but also like just a lot of sort of critical theorists who are dealing with the problem in the 1920s of why the working class fought each other in World War I. What they did was that they argued that the superstructure, that is everything that I just talked about, that's not the means of production, the media, culture, blah, 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 also informs how the means of production are used. So I guess that's like my general framework, is that the means of production and culture and the media, they inform each other in sort of a mutually constitutive process. Now, sometimes the means of production are more important, sometimes the media is more important, or whatever. Well, rarely is it more important, but like has a determinant effect. And so I think that's my general sort of framework of view of the world. And I think that what it is up to the individual analyst or political actor who's moving through history, person A, like let's say me, what it's up for me to do is to determine at my particular historical moment is most important, and then sort of organize around that fact. I don't mean organize in sort of like the labor organizing sense, but organize my like political project around this fact. And for me, just to talk about what that leads to what we've talked about before, to me, in my own reading of history, and of course I'm just one subjective person. I could very well be wrong. I make no claims to knowing everything in the world. To me, I think
you misinterpreted the question.
So do you?
I'm kidding. I'm fucking with you. Go ahead.
Okay. Right. So just very briefly, the way that I view society, and particularly how power works in the societies, that it's primarily organized through institutions that are meaningfully related to the grassroots, but also have a connection to sort of the elite sphere of policymaking. And that's why I focus so much on institutions, because I think this is where the left is able to get, again, as we talked about in the first half, a weak left is going to be able to get the most bang for its buck. And that's sort of how I view things. And then there's philosophical questions that we could get to as well about values and things like that.
Well, so that's okay. So let's connect that. So, but first, let's deal with the institutional piece a little bit too. And how problematic is that, in the proper sense of the word, that the left has thought of itself primarily as dissidents or media entrepreneurs or outside agitators versus institution builders for decades?
I think that's Well, first of all, I should say that I think there's historical reasons for that.
Sure.
I think that I'm on the left and we love criticizing ourselves. I tend to sort of emphasize and perhaps overemphasize what I consider to be pathologies on the left, like, for example, fetishizing working outside of the system as opposed to within it and things like that. But I think it's also fair to say that the American state for 100 plus years has done, excuse me, everything in its power to structurally weaken the left through, everything from bugging Martin Luther King Jr.'s room to arresting, as we talked about in the first one, Eugene V. Debs, and arresting other socialists and basically making it impossible to join the Communist Party. So there's a lot of reasons for this. But I would say that a problem, let's say in the last 40, 50 years of leftist thought, is that it didn't have to take the left didn't take sort of the process of building institutions where they could sort of organize politically and strategically seriously enough in terms of creating an alternative governance structure to what actually exists in the United States. So, for example, it's starting now, but for a long time, where is the anti-imperialist think tank, right? Let's say Bernie won. We talked about this a million times. I don't want to belabor it, but if Bernie won, who would have staffed his NSC? It's not an obvious. The answer would have been a bunch of people from the Obama administration. That's the truth. And so I think that the left going forward, when it does seem to be that a lot of people under 45 actually do have left-wing commitments, or at least sympathetic in some broad sense to left-wing causes, they need to take, and I'll use this term, a more Leninist understanding of how politics works and start building a vanguard and cadre that is able to move within the actual institutions of American power from its own institutions that we will build over time and then affect the levers of power in a direct way.
All right. So what then is the cultural sensibility and cultural story? And, bring, because the Gramsci piece is so relevant, right? Because if we don't, like you talked about in the first part about like the problematic tendency of a puritanical, like cultural memory, which we're carrying. So even if we think we're doing like, the example, I always use the example of the screenplay, that you can be writing very different movies, and of course the movie differences matter, but there's also an underlying structure and set of the game. So like, we look at the New Republic, Clinton era, blame the poor, racism in the 1990s. And we all, including a lot of the people who probably wrote it themselves, can on some level recognize how awful it was. Or if they're, Andrew Sullivan, just still defend it and then get tweeted out by Barack Obama. But then, in today's world, all of a sudden it's actually quite appropriate to write like hillbilly elegy or dying of whiteness, or, like go to another demographic. And again, I'll always emphasize that the historical stakes of demonizing white people obviously is just different because of the, terrorist history of this country. That's an objective reality. And at the same time, the narrative structure is very damn similar, and it serves some very crucial similar functions, which is namely to not have a discussion about resources and power and culturally pathologize groups of people who are victims in the economic system, whether they be in Detroit or Appalachia, Ohio, or, the Bronx. So, and in that sense, I like the Gramscian idea that if you don't have like a kind of fundamental counter-hegemonic project, which I think can get really broad, right? I mean, I think this is where the spiritual stuff, the psychedelic stuff, that there's a lot of different elements and of how do you actually decolonize or get out of the dominant cultural mode. So what's the part of that story using Gramsci and the models, that are most useful, you think, for building an alternative way of doing and being in culture that's generative and appealing, and also really starts to try to shake up the dominant sort of modes?
Sure, I think that's a really important question. And so just to give people like a very quick précis on Gramsci, I think Gramsci uses hegemony in two distinct senses. One, he uses it in the broad sense of sort of the cultural norms and assumptions that everyone in society has, and it's sort of like the common sense understanding of hegemony. But when he's talking about political strategy, at least in my understanding, by reading the great Joseph A. Buttigieg Jr., who was the premier Gramsci scholar, I think Gramsci uses hegemony also when he's talking about political strategy, is that you need to take on sort of things that matter to the mass of people in your particular society in order to help bring them to sort of the right, what Gramsci thought was right, Marxist sort of political view of things. So in particular, when Gramsci was writing in 20s and 30s Italy, he said that Marxists need to take seriously two things. One, the church, like people really believed in the church, and so they needed to like sort of make their peace with the church in some meaningful way, even though Marxists don't want to make their peace with the church ultimately. In the short term, they need to. And they need to take seriously what Gramsci called the Southern question, which is the relationship of Southern Italy, poorer Italy, more rural Italy, Rome and below, and Sicily, and its relationship to Northern Italy. And that these things needed to become part of sort of socialist politics in order to win the mass of Italians onto the socialist side. So I think when we're talking about a left, we need to take seriously about what is sort of ideas that or beliefs or systems that a real mass politics could get behind in order to build a sort of Gramscian counter hegemony that we want to see in the world. I don't have any quick answers, but I'm just saying if we're going to use a Gramscian framework, that's an important way to do about it. But in terms of I think the question was more related to sort of the first ways that sort of how do we build a counter hegemonic structure to sort of challenge like the idea of capitalism. And I think that's going to be very difficult. I think that we could start building it, but it's going to be a generational project. I don't think like building the left-wing Fox News is going to do it for a variety of reasons, because I think that what I would take to be like an actual socialist Marxist platform is so out of whack with American cultural norms that we need to figure out how we're going to build something that complements those norms in a meaningful way. So just to spitballing here, sort of a Patreon podcast is like, how could we take liberty or freedom or like ideas of like those sort of like ideas of individual liberty and freedom and sort of fold them into a socialist project might be a way to sort of build the Gramscian hegemony that we're talking about. How do we do that? Through media, through discussion, through popular publication, through getting out and actually talking to people. And I think that's where Bernie might in the medium and long term have sort of salutary development by putting sort of new issues on the table, even though I think it obviously wasn't totally successful.
What do you think of the relationship in that mode of how the left in general, I think even the Bernie campaign, talks about these areas I've been hitting recently, like small business or petite bourgeoisie in the proper sense, not in like the bullshit Republican, Walmart's kind of a small business when you think about it. Let's go funnel them money. But like the actual segment of the economy that is still somewhat outside of the dominant monopolies. And related to that, this is more stark in the UK, and this is an example that people are not going to like. But if you look at like Tony Blair was really into the idea that part of the reason that labor could not appeal more broadly was because working class people, and certainly middle class people, but lower middle class people, like all along that kind of axis of people labor needed, they were very ambitious. And and clearly, if that was true in the UK, it's going to be doubly true in the United States. And again, there's a really important critique. I mean, there's a reason I've been playing so much and talking about Jose Mujica, and I actually do think we need to really interrogate consumerism, what meaning and purpose actually is. Cornel West is an incredible critic of the just total toxic success of this society. So we're not jettisoning any of that. And at the same time, even when you get kind of like generic pushback to socialist ideas in ways that are very easy intellectually to kind of respond to, but it shows where people's preoccupations are at. Like, it's not defending, mostly it's not defending like Amazon's ability to, brutalize its workforce. It's like, well, I don't want every NBA team to, win. I don't want everybody in the NFL to get a ring.
Yeah, or if I make a better fried chicken, why shouldn't I make more than the other guy? Or
Yeah,
something.
or even just more like, I've been reading Peter Sloterdijk's book called "You Must Change Your Life." This is, German philosopher, and certainly not someone on the left. But one thing that he's kind of doing, which is interesting, is he's taking certain religious ideas and certain ideas that have been, I think, actually are, Nietzsche was not talking about a political Übermensch project. That's a real misreading of Nietzsche. And what he's doing is taking it out of, his politics are not like, his politics are just kind of like Eurozone libertarian-y. And he's saying that life is about practices, and practices are about like each human being's ability to use their body as an instrument to ascend and to change and evolve. And in that sense, like Christian contemplative practices or Buddhist contemplative practices or the Olympics or Scientology, like in some respects are all doing the same thing. And I think it's actually a very useful framework because there is that deep human desire, I think. Like I don't, not to naturalize too much, but I don't think all ambition and all distinction making is purely a product of a capitalist culture. And I think that's another thing that the left needs to be able to be clear that we're not opposing, and then have a positive generative version of that of course addresses the toxic excesses.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is where my thought is very, very much influenced by Max Weber, who argued essentially that he argued that Marx was wrong. I think Weber was ultimately, he was wrong in his particulars, but he was right in his general, which I think is actually gets a lot of like what I like about Weber. He's often wrong in the particulars, but right in the general. He was essentially arguing that Marx says that all societies are always organized around class. And I think that's pretty much true in modernity. But what Weber's insight is that there could be other forms of social organization. So Weber, for example, referring to Germany, he's like, in Germany, it's not the bourgeoisie who stand at the top of like the hierarchical structure. It's the military, because in Germany, what matters is honor, and there's sort of militaristic values. And like, even if you don't have the most amount of capital, you're actually at the top of society. And I think that's a really useful insight. So when people come at me, when the big critique of socialism that I get a lot from people I know and peers is that you guys want to get rid of hierarchy. And in some sense, like I would like a world without hierarchy, but I think it's also intellectually honest to say something along the lines of, well, actually, the major purpose of socialism is not to get rid of hierarchy per se, but it's to get rid of the hierarchy based on the distribution of material resources and wealth. And that human beings, and again, not to naturalize, but I do think nothing is 100% ever. I think anthropologists have shown that over and over again. But there is a tendency, for whatever reason, for human beings to create societies in which there are forms of hierarchy. And what socialists want to do is get rid of the hierarchy based on class while recognizing that there will be other forms of hierarchy. And so, for example, I think in our society, if you happen to be a very good-looking person, traditionally good-looking, however defined, I think we all live in a culture and we know who is considered good-looking. Idris Elba and Brad Pitt are considered good-looking and other people are not, whatever it may be. There will be forms of hierarchy in our society. And so I think it might be worthwhile, at least in the short term, to sort of not appear like pie in the sky, but just emphasize what types of hierarchies we're okay with and what types of hierarchies we're not okay with, even if in the end we want to abandon all hierarchies. And then one quick thing, and then I'll stop. I think the idea of the small business owner is an incredibly important part of American culture, going back to Jefferson.
Yes.
And obviously Jefferson had an enormous amount of problems, incredibly racist, literally raped his Sally Hemings, had family, was horrible, didn't free, I believe, either her, I forget if he freed the children that he had with her, I don't remember, but definitely didn't free Sally Hemings after he died, so a lot of problems. But one of the things that I think about Jefferson that was very influential is that he wanted to essentially create a society of small landowners, which I think is a cultural aspect that is really embedded in American culture, the idea of the small business owner. And that might be an element of sort of hegemonic or counter-hegemonic politics that the left in the short term and medium term might want to fold into its own message before we get to sort of the larger critiques of consumerism that I agree with 1,000%. But sort of my philosophical agreements might not necessarily always line up with how I think the left should move forward strategically. I think it's an important distinction to make.
Absolutely. In the last couple of minutes, I mean, do you think, so there's kind of like, all right, there's just loosening up in a sense, so that basically so that we go back to being an open culture versus a closed culture. I think that was kind of what we were talking about in the first part. less, controlling and policing of tone, practices, whatever. And absorbing these other things and working with them, whether it's ambition, business, or whatever. What now, especially as there's been serious setbacks, could the left do to either directly cultivate an institutional base or start to reformat thinking somewhat in that institutional way? Because, you see a lot of bedtime stories like, well, the polls are good on specific issues, or, what really matters is, some random like local race or whatever. Again, hugely important, no doubt, but obviously not remotely as important as electing Bernie Sanders president. And then in the specific moment we're in, there actually is some real opportunity, I think, to revitalize labor. And all of a sudden, like strikes have become infinitely more relevant because of the situation we're in. So how does thinking, because of this institutional setback, how do we resist the tendency to go back to the old, like, oh, we're going to organize from the outside and we're going to have pressure and the real thing is the long term and yada, yada, blah, 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 all of that kind of nonsense. I mean, there's a lot of truth to it, but there's also just a huge amount of like, it's just a lot of fantasy that says, okay, this is where we are. This is the opportunities and perils. How do we actually start to turn that into thinking institutionally?
I think that two things that the left could do. I think that the left could really take advantage of Americans' notion of fairness and justice. So I think like most Americans, like you alluded to before, have the idea that like what Amazon does isn't just or fair, or that what Walmart does isn't just or fair. And so sort of playing on notions of like what is considered fair in American society is, I think, that the way the left can make use of sort of American ways of viewing things in order to build towards its sort of larger project. And I think directly related to that, I think the left could begin by expanding the notion of what's considered a public good. So, for example, I don't think it would actually take that much institutionally to do something like nationalize Amazon or nationalize Walmart or nationalize internet service providers, right? And I think like in the left, like efflorescence of left-wing thinking at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, I want to emphasize there was a lot of problems with that. A lot of the sort of progressive era left was like quite racist and quite, patriarchal in a lot of very bad ways. And I fully admit that. But at the same time, they did get things like public subway systems, or public lighting companies or things along those lines. So I think that we could like build on those sorts of messages to say like Amazon is essentially government funded already through tax breaks, through using roads. The same with Walmart. They get an enormous amount of tax breaks. So expanding these sorts of the imagination of these things as public goods and relating that to notions of fairness and justice, that if you work for Walmart, you should have health insurance. You should be able to have a living wage. Same for Amazon. If you work for, a cable company, things along those lines. Maybe we should have a national airline or an actual invigorated high-speed rail system and things along those lines. So I think that would be sort of like the Gramscian war of position that we could use to sort of move the conversation in our direction, even though Bernie lost. And I think there's actually a lot of space to be had, because I think there's like an underlying idea in the United States, and that was reflected in Trump's election, that like things are fucked up and bullshit, and that we don't want it anymore, and that we need to take advantage of that and push that in a particular direction. Because I do think people have that sense that it's not right that people work for 80 hours a week and are poor. That's not in any way considered just or fair in this country, and sort of build on that would, I think, be a useful way to move forward.
Final question. Define war of position for everybody. We're going to need to use this term a lot.
The war of position being the idea that, again, you just have to recognize your historical moments and really try to fight where there's openings, because we're not always going to have the revolution of 1917. And that I think in this country, we're not going to have the revolution in 1917, or Cuba, late 1950s, early 60s, or whatever, or even the Chavez, revolution, or the pink tide in Latin America, right? We're nowhere near that. And so sort of fighting a meaningful war in position over the medium and long term is, I think, something that really useful that we could do.
Thank you, Bessner. As always, much appreciated, brother. Stay safe, stay healthy. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Michael. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Take care. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.